Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty unsettling paradox from World War II. It's all wrapped up in one man, German Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist. And his story, well, it really makes you question what actually drives a person in the middle of a war. So the first thing you absolutely have to understand about Kleist is this. He wasn't a true believing Nazi. Not at all. A lot of the German high command were fanatics, right? But Kleist, he was a professional soldier from a classic military family. And that distinction, that's what makes this whole thing a real mystery. And then there's the other side of the coin. Even though he wasn't driven by some fanatical ideology, his military campaigns were carried out with just shocking brutality. I mean, total efficiency, completely in line with the absolute horror of the Eastern Front. So you have to ask, how do those two things even exist in the same person? To really get to the bottom of this, we need to zoom in on a specific time and place, the Caucasus campaign, because it's right here, on this front, that we see both sides of him in action, his brutal effectiveness and his incredibly calculated mind. You know, the stakes in the Caucasus were just immense. This was a huge part of the 1942 German summer offensive, a strategic push for one thing: oil, the absolute lifeblood of any modern army. And to get it, German forces were fighting through incredibly harsh mountain terrain against a fierce Soviet defense. The pressure was unbelievable. Just try to picture it for a second. German panzer divisions just grinding their way through these desolate, unforgiving landscapes. That was Kleist's world. He was the one directing this brutal, mechanical advance, pushing the war forward one bloody mile at a time. And that brings us right back to the core of the problem, this contradiction. So let's really unpack it. Let's look at how his methods on the ground seem so completely at odds with his personal mindset. This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If it wasn't a passionate belief in the cause that was driving him, then what was it? What on earth fueled this mix of strategic genius and absolute ruthlessness? Well, the answer is a lot more complex and, frankly, a bit more chilling than just simple fanaticism. Yeah, this slide just lays it all out, plain and simple. On one side, you've got the method. Brutal, efficient, never flinching. And on the other, the mindset, a professional soldier, not some political true believer. Seeing them side by side like this, man, it really drives home the disconnect we're trying to figure out. Okay, so here's the twist. Here's what he was really doing. Kleist's secret weapon wasn't fanaticism. It was a cold, calculating pragmatism. He basically replaced political ideology with a deep, strategic understanding of human psychology. He literally turned the feelings of the local population into a weapon of war. And this is the key. Where other commanders just saw enemies or obstacles, Kleist saw an opportunity. He realized that a lot of the local people in the Caucasus, groups like the Chechens and others, had major grievances against Soviet rule. And he decided he could use that. He could weaponize their resentment. So he put together what was basically this cynical three-step playbook. First, figure out exactly what the people hated about their Soviet rulers. Second, frame the German invasion not as a conquest, but as a liberation from those rulers. And third, use all that newfound goodwill to secure supply lines, get intelligence, and just generally make his military objectives easier to achieve. It was brilliant, and it was deeply cynical. And you have to understand, this was a totally different way of doing things for the German army at the time. This wasn't about spreading Nazi ideology, it was pure pragmatism. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was treating the local population like a strategic resource to be managed. And to do that, you needed a level of political and cultural savvy that was pretty rare. So, how do we put all these pieces together? How do we make sense of it all? Let's try to reconcile the two sides of Marshal von Kleist, the brutal enforcer and the cunning strategist, to see what kind of legacy that leaves us with. This table really sums it up perfectly. You've got the enforcer, the guy who carried out horrific orders with deadly efficiency. Then you've got the strategist, the guy who used sophisticated psychological tactics to win. And what do you get when you put them together? You get a person who became a highly effective but morally empty instrument of war. And that right there is the big takeaway. Kleist's story is this powerful, really disturbing reminder that you don't need to be a true believer to be a deadly effective part of a brutal regime. Professionalism, ambition, cold calculation, those things can be every bit as powerful and every bit as destructive as ideological fire.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really tough question to chew on. We can look at Kleist's strategy and admit that from a purely military standpoint, it was brilliant. But does that brilliance in any way excuse the massive moral compromise of serving the regime he served? That's a question with no easy answer, and it's definitely one worth thinking about.